Armie Hammer was the golden boy of Hollywood, with a lineage worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet today, he is reportedly selling timeshares in the Cayman Islands to survive. The House of Hammer represents one of the most staggering falls from grace in American history, shifting from the heights of global diplomacy to a public execution by scandal. Most audiences focused on the shocking headlines of the Armie Hammer controversy, but the real rot was not a modern invention. It was a genetic inheritance. The true devastation of this empire was triggered by a single handwritten ledger buried in a Caribbean vault, a document that proved the family fortune was less of a treasury and more of a crime scene. This is the dark history of the Hammer family dynasty, a saga that proves wealth is not a shield, but a magnifying glass for the shadows of the soul. The Armie Hammer documentary that the world watched in real time was only the final act of a century-long tragedy that began in the smoke-filled rooms of revolutionary Russia. To understand how a movie star ends up in a tabloid nightmare, you have to look at the man who built the pedestal he fell from. Long before the public accusations surfaced, the family was defined by a specific brand of cold, calculating ambition that ignored both borders and morality. The Hammer family history is not a story of self-made success, but a chronicle of financial predation and the art of the deal at its most lethal. This was an empire built on the bones of a collapsed monarchy and sustained by the secrets of two warring superpowers. The genesis of this greed began with Julius Hammer, a radical physician who viewed human life as a secondary concern to his ideological goals. In 1919, Julius was a prominent member of the American Communist Party, a man who believed the ends always justified the means. His career ended in disgrace and a prison cell after he performed a fatal medical procedure on the wife of a Russian diplomat. While Julius sat behind bars, he passed his cold-blooded philosophy to his son, Armand Hammer, who would become the architect of the dynasty. Armand did not just want to practice medicine or run a business. He wanted to own the very systems that governed the world. Armand Hammer arrived in Russia during the devastating famine of 1921, but he did not come to provide aid. He came to pick the pockets of a dying empire. He recognized that Vladimir Lenin was desperate for resources and used that desperation to secure the first major trade concessions ever granted to an American. Armand traded American grain for Russian furs, caviar, and stolen Tsarist jewelry that had been stripped from the palaces of the Romanovs. He was not a traditional businessman, but a financial vulture who realized that laws were merely negotiable expenses for those with enough leverage. He became the primary bridge between Washington and Moscow, a man who could walk into the Kremlin and the White House with the same level of casual entitlement. This was the birth of a shadow monopoly that would define the family for the next 3 generations. Armand learned early on that the most valuable currency was not gold, but information and influence. He spent his early years laundering the wealth of the old world into the foundations of the new one, ensuring that the Hammer name was synonymous with untouchable power. He viewed people as assets to be liquidated and family members as tools to be utilized. This predatory nature was the silent engine of their growth, a dark energy that propelled them into the stratosphere of the global elite. However, the higher they climbed, the more precarious their footing became, as the secrets of the past began to weigh down the promises of the future. The wealth was never meant to be shared. It was meant to be used as a leash. Armand established a culture of psychological warfare within his own home, ensuring that his descendants would be forever dependent on his approval and his bank account. He forced his own relatives to sign away their inheritances at the end of a barrel, proving that the family bond was nothing more than a legal fiction. This cycle of abuse and control created a fragile structure that was destined to shatter the moment a true crisis emerged. The stage was set for a century of excess, but the foundation was already beginning to crumble under the weight of its own deception. This was the beginning of a legacy that would eventually lead to a quiet vault in the Caymans, where the truth was waiting to be found. By the 1950s, Armand Hammer had reached a crossroads that would define the next half-century of global energy. He took a dying shell company known as Occidental Petroleum, which at the time was little more than a tax write-off with 3 employees, and weaponized it into a global titan. He didn't achieve this through superior engineering or logistical brilliance. He did it through pure, unadulterated bribery and a total disregard for international law. Armand realized that while the major oil companies played by a set of established rules, he could win by simply buying the referee. He began a systematic campaign of influence that targeted the most vulnerable and corruptible regimes on the planet. The crown jewel of his empire was the Libyan oil fields, which he secured by bypassing every standard corporate protocol. To win the favor of King Idris, Armand didn't just offer better percentages. He treated the monarch like a personal deity. He gifted the king gold-plated weapons and funneled millions of dollars in untraceable cash into private accounts. He even went as far as to build a massive agricultural project in the middle of the desert just to prove he could bend nature to his will. This wasn't a business negotiation. It was a masterclass in geopolitical seduction that gave Occidental a seat at the table with the world's most powerful cartels. Armand was a master of the double cross, a man who viewed loyalty as a commodity to be traded. In 1972, he looked toward the American political machine and saw another opportunity for leverage. He funneled $54,000 in illegal campaign contributions to Richard Nixon, a move that would later result in a criminal conviction he would eventually use his influence to erase. He understood that in the high-stakes world of energy, a president in your pocket was worth more than 1 billion barrels in the ground. He moved through the halls of power in Washington with the same cold calculation he used in the Kremlin, serving as a back-channel diplomat who could bridge the gap between 2 warring superpowers for his own profit. The cruelty of his professional life was mirrored in the way he managed his own bloodline. He owned some of the most expensive art in the world, yet he reportedly forced his own family members to sign away their inheritance at gunpoint to ensure his total control. He was worth over $200 million during a time when a gallon of gas cost only 36 cents, making him one of the wealthiest men to ever walk the earth. He didn't just want money. He wanted to be the only man alive who could call both the Soviet leadership and the White House on the same afternoon and have both sides pick up the phone. His dominance was built on a foundation of absolute fear and financial entrapment. He maintained a dossier on every business partner and family member, using secrets as a form of currency to prevent any internal rebellion. By the time the 1980s arrived, Occidental Petroleum was a shadow government unto itself, operating with a level of autonomy that terrified his competitors. He had successfully transformed a bankrupt shell into a multi-billion-dollar machine that fueled his ego and funded a lifestyle of unimaginable excess. But as the monopoly grew, so did the number of enemies waiting for the patriarch to finally show a moment of weakness. The peak of the Hammer dynasty was a fever dream of ego fueled by a total detachment from reality. Armand Hammer did not just live well. He lived like a sovereign emperor who viewed the globe as his personal backyard and international laws as mere suggestions for the less fortunate. He navigated the skies in a private Boeing 727 that functioned as a flying command center, draped in the finest appointments money could buy. This was not just a mode of transport. It was a statement of absolute dominance over time and space. He maintained mansions across the world that operated with the efficiency and security of small nations. Every detail of his existence was designed to broadcast an image of untouchable power and infinite liquidity. This obsession with his own legacy reached a breaking point when Armand spent $30 million on a single manuscript by Leonardo da Vinci. It was one of the most significant scientific documents in human history, but to Armand, it was just another branding opportunity. He immediately stripped the document of its historical title and renamed it the Codex Hammer. This act of intellectual vanity sent shockwaves through the academic world, yet it perfectly illustrated his pathology. He believed that with enough capital, he could purchase history itself and rewrite the past in his own image. To Armand, the manuscript was not a treasure of the Renaissance. It was a trophy that proved his name was more important than the genius of the man who wrote it. Behind the velvet curtains and the polished gold, the family dynamic was a theatrical performance of calculated cruelty. Armand treated his wife Frances like a ghost, keeping her isolated while he maintained a rotating string of mistresses who were brazenly placed on the corporate payroll of Occidental Petroleum. These women were not just companions, they were administrative assets used to facilitate his lifestyle and stroke his massive ego. The family traveled with a small army of armed security, staying in hotel suites that cost more for a single night than a middle-class American family earned in an entire year. Every interaction was choreographed to maintain the illusion of a perfect golden bloodline, even as the internal rot began to fester. The lifestyle was a grand facade built on a foundation of shifting sand. To the public, Armand was a visionary billionaire with a Midas touch. But the internal ledgers told a different story. The billions were not coming from legitimate market growth. They were being siphoned through corporate embezzlement disguised as necessary business expenses and complex offshore shell games. He was essentially burning the furniture of his empire to keep the palace warm for one more night. Every private jet flight and every diamond necklace was another brick pulled from the structural wall of the family's future. They were living on borrowed time and stolen capital, assuming the bill would never come due. This era represented the total victory of image over substance. Armand wanted to be the only man on the planet who could call the Kremlin and the White House on the same afternoon and be greeted as an equal by both. He viewed world leaders as peers and his own family as subordinates or obstacles to be managed. The children and grandchildren grew up in a world where money was an infinite resource and morality was a foreign concept. They were raised in the shadow of a man who believed he had conquered the world through sheer force of will. But as the 1980s drew to a close, the weight of the lies began to exceed the strength of the foundation. The stage was set for a collapse that would be as spectacular as the rise. The illusion of immortality shattered on a cold December night in 1990. Armand Hammer was dead at 92, leaving behind a wake of private jets, stolen masterpieces, and a family that hovered over his casket like starving wolves. For decades, the Hammer name was a golden passport that opened doors from the Kremlin to the Oval Office. But the moment the patriarch's heart stopped, the machinery of the dynasty began to grind itself into dust. The heirs didn't gather to mourn a grandfather. They gathered to claim a kingdom they believed was worth billions of dollars. They expected a liquid fortune that would fund their decadence for another century. What they found instead was a labyrinth of debt, deceit, and a mountain of litigation that would eventually swallow them whole. The true nature of the Hammer wealth was revealed to be a house of cards held together by Armand's sheer force of will. Within months, the family was hit with over 1,000 individual lawsuits. These weren't just disgruntled business partners. These were family members, former mistresses, and charitable organizations realizing that Armand had promised the same dollar to 5 different people. The legal fees began to hemorrhage money at a rate of over $3 million per year. The fortress of Occidental Petroleum, which Armand had ruled like a private fiefdom, immediately moved to distance itself from his ghost. The board of directors realized that the legendary chairman had been using the corporate treasury as a personal piggy bank for decades, and they were determined to claw back every cent. As the money evaporated, the psychological rot within the family began to leak into the public record. Casey Hammer, Armand's own granddaughter, would later pull back the curtain on a cycle of systemic abuse that defined their private lives. The Hammers didn't just compete for money. They engaged in psychological warfare designed to break one another. Armand had reportedly forced his own son, Julian, to sign away his rights to the family fortune while being held at the end of a barrel. This wasn't a family in the traditional sense. It was a collection of hostages bound together by a trust fund that was rapidly reaching zero. The prestige of the name was gone, replaced by a reputation for cruelty and financial instability. By the mid-1990s, the Hammer estate was a shell of its former glory. The legendary $40 million art collection, once the envy of the world's elite, became a focal point for investigators. They discovered that many of the pieces were tied to complex international money laundering schemes, or were outright fakes designed to inflate the family's net worth for bank loans. The high-stakes theater of their existence was falling apart as the IRS began circling the remaining assets. The transition from the third to the fourth generation wasn't a passing of the torch. It was a desperate scramble for survival. The heirs were left with the expensive tastes of emperors, but the bank accounts of commoners, setting the stage for a final, public collapse. The collapse of the Hammer dynasty was not a slow decline, but a sudden, violent shattering of a 100-year-old illusion. For decades, the public believed the family sat upon a mountain of liquid gold and priceless masterpieces. They saw Armie Hammer as the ultimate refinement of that bloodline, a polished, leading man who represented the successful transition from Soviet-era oil grit to Hollywood royalty. But the foundation was hollow. In 2021, the carefully constructed facade disintegrated when leaked messages revealed a psychological darkness that mirrored the predatory nature of his ancestors. This was not a modern scandal. It was the genetic manifestation of a century of unchecked ego, proving that the family had spent 4 generations consuming everything in their path until there was nothing left to eat but themselves. The true death blow came from a single, handwritten ledger buried deep within a vault in the Cayman Islands. This ledger was the final answer to the mystery of the vanishing $40 million art collection. When auditors and investigators finally gained access to the family's private records, they discovered that the legendary Hammer fortune was a mirage. The famous collection, once thought to be the crown jewel of the family estate, was largely composed of high-quality fakes or pieces tied to international money laundering schemes. Armand Hammer had used the art world as a private bank, moving assets across borders to evade the Internal Revenue Service and hide his tracks from global regulators. The Dynasty had been insolvent for years, surviving only on the momentum of its own reputation and a mountain of revolving debt that could no longer be serviced. As the legal proceedings intensified, the mechanics of the downfall became clear to the world. The Hammers had been burning through their principal for decades, using corporate embezzlement disguised as business expenses to maintain their private jets and sprawling mansions. They had no real assets left, only the shadow of an oil empire that had been absorbed by rivals long ago. The trust funds were dry. The properties were leveraged to the hilt. When the creditors realized the art was worthless, the house of cards collapsed in a matter of months. The mansions were seized and sold to pay off a fraction of the outstanding debt, leaving the heirs with nothing but a name that had become a global punchline. The destruction of the Hammer legacy was final and absolute. The family did not just lose their money to the market or bad luck. They lost it because the primary engine of their wealth was fraud. From the grain deals with Vladimir Lenin to the gold-plated bribes in Libya, the Hammers had always operated outside the law. They believed that being part of the global elite meant they were immune to the consequences of their actions. But the world had changed, and the shadow accounts that once protected them became the digital trail that destroyed them. The Dynasty was officially dead before the first headline about Armie Hammer's personal life ever reached the public. The scandalous messages were merely the scream of a ghost that had already been evicted from its palace. The Hammer name now serves as a grim reminder that a reputation built on secrets cannot survive the light of the modern age. They spent a century trying to buy immortality and influence, only to end up as a cautionary tale of aristocratic rot. The seats they once held at the tables of power are occupied by new titans who have scrubbed the Hammer influence from their boardrooms. The legacy is gone, replaced by a permanent record of criminal ambition and psychological warfare. In the end, the Hammers didn't just lose their seat at the table. They lost the right to be remembered as anything other than a family of vultures who finally ran out of victims to pick clean. The fall of the Hammers is the ultimate proof that wealth is not a shield, but an accelerant for the darkness within. It takes a man's deepest flaws and gives them the resources to go global until the weight of the lies becomes too heavy to carry. If you want to see how the next great empire falls and who is currently hiding their own handwritten ledger, hit the subscribe button. Gravity always wins. Today, the Hammer name is synonymous with a specific brand of aristocratic rot. The billions are gone. The oil empire was absorbed by rivals who scrubbed the Hammer name from the boardrooms. Armie Hammer was spotted selling timeshares in the Caymans, a poetic descent from a man whose ancestor once dictated terms to Joseph Stalin. The legacy is a cautionary tale of old money that forgot the first rule of survival, which is discretion. They thought they were too big to fail, too rich to be judged, and too powerful to be caught. They were wrong. The money did not vanish into thin air. It was simply reclaimed by the chaos that created it. The final autopsy of the Hammer dynasty reveals a terrifying truth about generational wealth. It was never a solid foundation built on innovation or service. It was a high-stakes shell game played across 3 continents and 4 generations. When the music stopped, there were no chairs left for the heirs. The massive headquarters in Los Angeles, once a monument to Armand's ego, now serves as a reminder of how quickly a name can be erased. The boardroom seats are occupied by strangers who view the Hammer era as a dark period of corporate instability that had to be purged for the sake of the shareholders. The physical remnants of their power have been liquidated to satisfy a growing list of creditors and legal claimants. The yachts were sold, the private jets were grounded, and the mansions were partitioned into smaller lots. Even the charitable foundations once used to polish their public image have been shuttered or rebranded to avoid the toxic association with the Hammer bloodline. What remains is a digital trail of scandals and a cautionary lesson for the global elite. The family did not just lose their fortune. They lost the ability to control their own narrative, which is the ultimate failure for a dynasty that once manipulated world leaders. Armie Hammer's current reality is a stark contrast to the gilded cage he was born into. Selling vacation properties in a tax haven is perhaps the most honest work a member of this family has done in a century. It is a humble conclusion to a saga that began with a radical physician and peak with a global oil tycoon. The shadow accounts are frozen, the art is proven to be a collection of clever forgeries, and the handwritten ledger remains a silent witness to their crimes. The Hammer story proves that when an empire is built on a foundation of lies, it does not matter how high you build the walls. Wealth is not a shield. It is an accelerant. It takes your deepest flaws and gives them the resources to go global. The Hammers spent a century trying to buy immortality, only to end up as a footnote in a true crime archive. They were the masters of the double cross and the kings of the offshore account, but they could not outrun the consequences of their own nature. Gravity always wins, especially when the weight of a century of fraud is pulling you down. If you want to see how the next empire falls, hit the subscribe button.